Hello there. Super excited to go live and share with you today one of the hot off the press just this month article published on sensory processing and OT in functional neurologic disorders. So we're going to dive in. If we haven't met, my name is Julie Hirschberg. I am actually not an OT. Gosh, I love talking about the OT stuff, but I am a physical therapist, a neurologic physical therapist. I am the owner and founder of re+active Therapy and Wellness. I'm in the Los Angeles area, and I love to talk about functional neurologic disorders. This week particularly, we did a boot camp for clinicians on F&D. We had a lot of OTs in our boot camp, and this article came out. A couple of my colleagues from Mass General shared it with me, and I shared it with the boot camp, and we all got excited. And then I was like, I gotta talk about this article. There's some really great stuff in it. And then we did a free workshop just last night for clinicians to really talk about some of the latest in functional neurologic disorders. And then we opened our doors for clinicians to our Brain Bytes membership. And whenever we do that, I am so excited to be surrounded by really enthusiastic and passionate clinicians who care a lot about disorders that might not be well understood, like functional neurologic disorder. So there's a lot happening this week. And so when I got to read this article, I was excited, particularly one. This is from the group at Mass General. I think all of them are at Mass General. Yes, they are. So Mass General Hospital in Boston. I actually got to teach a course with Julie MacLean, one of the authors on here, and then Julie MacLean and Jessica Ranford, two OTs from Mass General, did a fantastic talk in our Brain Bytes group. So this is one of the most watched and most used talks that's in our membership community by these two leaders in the field when it comes to occupational therapy, sensory processing, and functional neurologic disorders. So when my other colleagues, my PT friends at Mass General, sent me this article, I was like, oh my gosh, this is great. And I couldn't wait to share it with you all. So here we are today. I'm going to give you the name of the article. I'll send a link in our newsletter today. If you're a clinician, if you're a patient, I'll send it in our newsletter on Monday. And the article is called Sensory Processing Difficulties and Occupational Therapy Outcomes for Functional Neurologic Disorder. This is from Neurology, so the publication from the American Academy of Neurology. And this was a retrospective study, meaning they went backwards and looked at the outcomes and assessments for a cohort of people with functional neurologic disorder. In fact, I think it was 77 people. Not a bad amount, and quite a heterogeneous group of people with F&D as well. So folks with functional seizures, functional motor disorders, functional speech disorders, all included in that cohort. This was with adults. Somebody is asking, hello, you can sign up for our newsletter. In fact, I posted today, if you're a clinician, you can sign up at reactiveeducation.com, but also if you comment on any of our lives or any of the posts I did earlier today to announce this live, if you comment newsletter, I'll also send you the link to sign up, because we have two newsletters, one for patients, one for clinicians. So yeah, if you're a clinician or other healthcare professional, reactiveeducation.com is where you sign up. And okay, so this article again, Sensory Processing Difficulties and OT Outcomes for Functional Neurologic Disorder. And I'm going to go through some of the pieces of it. But I mentioned 77 people. So they retrospectively did a chart review, looked at folks, and they use the Adolescent and Adult Sensory Profile, or AASP. This is what we use also. Thanks to their great work, because they published about this and have shown differences in folks with F&D. And we were seeing these clinically. This is a great way to characterize some of those sensory differences. They use in this adolescent and adult sensory profile, when it is rated, there are 4 quadrants that you see, and I'll actually post, they have a really lovely little figure. I'll just show it to you here. It looks like that. I'll post this in our stories today. This 4 quadrant sensory processing model is really helpful for anybody, I think, understanding their nervous system and their sensory system. The 4 quadrants go from low registration to sensory sensitivity, sensation seeking, and sensation avoidance. I already know I'm sensation seeking. I could just tell you that. But what they wanted to do, and they've done some prior work in this, is actually look at where are people with functional neurologic disorders classified, and then how do they do with OT, which is a great thing to know. So I'll post a picture of that 4 quadrants. And this is something that has been used for a very long time with many other disorders, and particularly folks with sensory processing difficulties. So for folks with autism, for example. And what they did is, so they looked, they retrospectively did chart reviews for these 77 people. The majority had functional motor disorders. So 57 of them did. 27 had some sort of mixed disorder. They had folks with gait disorder, tremor, weakness, jerks, tics, dystonia, blepharospasm, and 29 of them had functional seizures. Really helpful to know. And 21 had functional speech difficulties. So a lot of folks had overlap of those. And I know this is really common because I see this, that people have overlapping symptoms. So that was their cohort. And I think it's always important to know who was in the study. So who does it apply to, right? So then they looked back at the OT assessment and treatment, and they have a much like we do, where they do an hour-long evaluation and they do hour-long follow-up sessions, which I think is great. I think this is what people with complex conditions really need, anybody with functional neurologic disorder. And they have a really nice outline of their sensory modulation treatment program as well. I've talked about this before in another live where I reviewed one of their articles where they really kind of go step by step through this, but I want to just give you a brief view of this because this is also what they covered in detail and showed cases with in our Brain Bytes membership. So they have 4 goals in this sensory modulation program. The first goal is facilitating a self-awareness of sensory processing patterns that the person has. The second is exploring self-regulation strategies. The third is expanding the repertoire of that, bringing it into different environments. And then the 4 is repertoire expansion and skill enhancement. So bringing that into daily life and really taking that idea of sensory snacks and meals and diet and putting that into an everyday life. And they break up those goals into 8 different modules that are, it's not a workbook, by the way, but really key areas of sensory modulation that would need to be addressed with a person with functional neurologic disorder. So I think it's really nice to be able to see the process around this. I'm always so excited when I pull up a clinical journal article and it actually talks through some of the protocol, because how else am I going to apply this, right? So I think they do a really nice way of doing that. So then they looked at those sensory profiles for folks. So the very first thing, and I put this chart in the post earlier today, they characterize the sensory processing patterns of their cohort of 77 people with FND. And what they found, they characterized it and compared it to norms. They found that folks with FND were much more likely to have low registration as their sensory profile, sensory sensitivity, and sensory avoidance. So those three of the four quadrants, they were more likely to have than other people. That's not surprising at all to me, because that is absolutely what we see as well. And that they've actually done some prior studies that found the same thing. So then they wanted to look at how does that maybe correlate or explain some of the changes for a person and their outcome. So they looked at the outcomes that folks had when they got OT. And OT, by the way, would include this sensory modulation, but it would also include other things for that person. And here's the good news. People got better. In fact, 62%, I read a ton of numbers in here. I'm going to make sure I get it right. I believe it was 62% were improved at the end of their therapy. Now, this was retrospective, so it's not that everybody got the same amount of therapy. And this is also really important. Some folks didn't get as much therapy. And there's many reasons why. Maybe it was really far away. Maybe they couldn't attend. Maybe they were working full time, right? The average for everybody was almost 10 sessions, 9.7 sessions. But it ranged from having only 2 sessions to having 49 sessions of OT. So that's quite a range. As Ethnicity Garden said, I improved with OT. Yeah, I really haven't seen somebody that doesn't improve with OT. But I have seen that people might not have access to OT that really understands F&D. I will say that, which is why I'm on my soapbox today, to like spread the word. Let's go OTs, let's go PTs, and really understanding some of these concepts. This paper is an OT paper. The sensory system is not only an OT thing, right? So PTs, you can absolutely take these concepts and test these things and utilize them 100%. So one of the things that they found is that, so again, average of 10 visits, but it ranged from 2 to 49, and they completed the course of their treatment on an average of 5 months. But again, that was a range. And they had many different versions. Some were in person, some were online, some were a hybrid, because they're a large medical center, right? Definitely looking at they're drawing from a large area. Not everybody's going to be able to do it in person. One of the things that they did find is that the more OT they had, the better they did. And that's not really surprising to me. And then they looked at some other pieces that were correlated or explained some of the difference. And I found this so interesting. So when they did, and it's a linear regression analysis for all you statistic nerds out there that are interested, what they did is actually looked at what was kind of explaining some of the difference. So I find this really interesting. Some of the things that were helping to predict where the sensory processing score was a lifetime history of anxiety disorder. That's not super surprising. We know that changes how we process sensory information. But migraine, history of migraine. Now, this is something we see so commonly in our folks with FND. And folks with migraine also can have some sensory processing changes or difficulties. So putting the two together, the presence of that history help predict some of the outcome in the sensory processing measure. That's really interesting, and also not surprising. Some of the other things were cognition. So if they had cognitive complaints, along with their functional neurologic disorder, which is also really common. And if they also had another neurologic disorder. Now, something they don't have in here, and I'd be super curious about, is what about other disorders? So they looked at migraine, and they looked at anxiety, and they looked at cognitive complaints or other neuro, but I would be very curious about maybe the presence of autism or hypermobility or autonomic dysfunction, because those can also influence our sensory processing and just the sensory feedback that we're getting from our body. So next time, I know that this is like one of those things, like we collect a lot of information when people come into our programs. We get their full history, we give them a lot of different questionnaires, and we do outcomes and things, and it's overwhelming to the patient to do all of these things. It's a lot. And I know when we first started, we had like 12 different outcomes, and we were like, this is too much. We narrowed it down, but of course you're always going, man, I wish we had captured that piece of data, because when it comes to publishing and sharing it, maybe there's some interesting findings in there. So anyway, this is the start. This is the very start of some really great information and data on the sensory system, on sensory processing, and functional neurologic disorders. So I wanted to share, those are the essential results that I gave you there, and that people improved with OT. Not surprising. I think OT is fabulous. And honestly, every human should have it. By the way, it's OT month. This is a month that we really celebrate OT. And I could not imagine what we do at Reactive without OT. And I really couldn't imagine it for a lot of folks with neurologic disorders or chronic conditions. I think everybody needs it. And I saw a comment in here from somebody, no PT has ever even offered OT as an option. They absolutely should. Now, I will say there's many shades of OT, right? When I worked in the hospital setting or inpatient rehab, occupational therapy primarily focused on fine motor skills, upper extremity skills, and getting dressed, getting to the bathroom, showering, which are really, really important occupations of your everyday life. That might not be the type of OT that you need, but maybe that's all that is available at that facility. Or hey, you know what? When I worked at inpatient rehab, that's all I knew of OT. I had not worked with the OTs like we have at Reactive that really take a big picture on an entire lifestyle for a person, nor had I worked with OTs that had really worked in the sensory world, which is a huge part of OT. I just missed out. I didn't know. One of the things, if you're a patient and you're like, where do I find this? I would really be looking for OT that can focus and look at lifestyle, all the components of your lifestyle, like sleep, energy, pacing, your diet, your stress management, all of those components of your lifestyle. I would also be looking for an OT that has this interest and maybe some training and background in sensory processing. Heck, just look at our Brain Bytes directory. So all of the clinicians that are in Brain Bytes are in a directory that we have. We published it online. It's at reactivept.com/Brain Bytes directory. Bytes is with a Y, by the way, like a computer byte. And we have all of our OTs and PTs that are training and mentoring with us are in that directory. So anyway, a little bit of a tangent there. One of the things that I wanted to bring up, a couple pieces that they share in their discussion session. One of the things is that this particular study brings some preliminary evidence. Remember, this was not a randomized controlled trial, but some preliminary evidence that people can get better with outpatient sensory-based OT. 62% of the patients with FND in this group had some clinical improvement. Amen to that, I would say. The other thing is that they found that it didn't matter whether it was motor or seizures or speech. Across the board, folks with FND tended to have these sensory profiles of low registration, sensory sensitivity, and sensation avoidance. Now, and then they also related these to something with like a comorbid migraine, right? And one of the things they said in the discussion that really resonated with me is that folks with FND may have this kind of extreme neurologic threshold for processing sensory stimuli. And maybe if you're a patient, you relate to this, right? That you might startle very easily. And I'll give you a couple of examples, by the way, that are in the 4 quadrants. And again, I'll post a picture of the 4 quadrants. So a sensory sensitivity may be that person that's sensitive to sounds and sensitive to lights and startles easily. Low registration is a person that maybe has less responses to sensation, or this happens to be like you end up with bruises or cuts and you don't even know how they happened. That might be a low registration. Sensory avoidance is, this one's probably really obvious, but that's the person that might avoid crowds or avoid concerts or avoid a place with a lot of sensory stimuli. Those 3 are really extreme neurologic thresholds. And we talk about this a lot with patients, is really understanding what their threshold is and how do we build that? How do we improve that threshold for a person? So they talk about that. So a person may have these changes in their neurologic threshold and also not great regulation strategies, or not even know. I'm going to be honest, before I went to therapy, I didn't have any self-regulation strategies, or they weren't very healthy strategies, I will say. They weren't good long-term strategies. So, and then if a person is also avoiding sensations, then they also, that will lead to a lot of functional decline, because then you're not actively participating in things that you want to do in life. So this gives us a lot of reason why we should both assess and treat the sensory system. OT could be a very big part of that. PTs can learn and do this as well. But if I were going to be like pie in the sky dream of what you should have, it would be reactive, because I think it's a dream to work at reactive, but it's to have PT, it's to have OT, it's to have psychology, speech therapy if you need it. Have all of those pieces together and integrated, but absolutely not missing the sensory piece. I think it's so important, and people with FND improve. And in fact, the more they get, it's like dose dependent, kind of like a medicine. The more OT, the better they get. So again, the study was called Sensory Processing Difficulties and OT Outcomes for FND, just published last week in Neurology Clinical Practice. I'll send a link to the article along with the videos and all of the other great stuff that we have shared. I'll put it in our newsletter this week. And if you are a clinician and you are like, I did not get any of this sensory processing stuff, and this applies not only to FND, but to concussion, but to migraine, to headaches, to pain, and to so many other things, and you want to dive in and you want to learn with us for an entire year, our doors are open right now to our Brain Bytes membership. This is the first time this year. They are open, and we are going to be hanging out, OTs, PTs, psychologists, and more, hanging out and doing this stuff together, doing the hard stuff, but doing it in a way that really supports ourselves too. So I wanted to invite you, check it out. It's at reactiveeducation.com/brainbytes. And we'd love to see you. Our doors close next week though, so get in there very soon. And in the meantime, if you have questions, keep reaching out to us online. I love to hear from you, and we do a lot of these lives based around your questions. This one was particularly from a lot of questions that I got in our boot camp this week. So thank you again so much for being here and for caring about this. It means a lot. So I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend, and I will see you soon.